I'm a social scientist. I started working here in the Center for User Experience Research in 2004. That's where I entered and where I was welcomed by my colleagues in the Center for Usability Research. Now we are 10 years later, and that is where I am today. But what has changed, apart from the fact that we're now residing in a building where we don't see the daylight anymore, and apart from the fact that you may have noticed that there was something else that changed, not only the location, but also something else. I'm still working in the Center for User Experience, or the CEO, as we refer to the abbreviation, but now it stands for the Center for User Experience Research, and no longer for the Center for Usability Research. So why is that? And there is more to say than just our move and changing usability into user experience. Actually, there is some kind of change or a shift in the domain of human-computer interaction as well. A shift which has given the role of a social scientist researcher a more prominent place. And that will be my talk of today, to explain to you what the role is of the social scientist in this domain of human-computer interaction. But to understand that and to explain that, I have to start from the beginning. Namely, what is HCI, or human-computer interaction? Human-computer interaction is actually a very interdisciplinary field, concerned with, and now I will be citing the definition of ACM, the Association for Computer Machinery, and it is concerned with the design, evaluation, and implementation of interactive computing systems for human use, and with a study of major phenomena surrounding them. So it's kind of a broad definition, and a lot of things fit into that, so it may not surprise that it is an interdisciplinary field. However, even though it's a very broad definition of our field that we are working in, what we've seen is that even within this broad definition, there have been some kind of different emphasis, different focus on the things that we have been studying and the research questions that we were formulating. And that is very important to understand. Very important to understand what our role can be as social scientists and how it fits in this evolution of thinking. And that is why I will talk you and introduce you today to a little bit of history of what we've run through in the field of human-computer interaction. So I will very, very briefly introduce to you the periodization of human-computer interaction research. And in general, we may discern three major phases in human-computer interaction research. Phases, or three major intellectual virtues. And we should not conceive this as a very strict distinction. On the contrary, we should see it as some kind of emphasis that was put. And sometimes these intellectual virtues kind of overlap or even coexist. But still, it is a very good rhetoric to describe some major shifts in our domain. And in general, what we will see is that we have gone through an evolution from researching and focusing upon what is technically feasible and finding technological solutions to account for our shortcomings, towards now a more thorough consideration of what is desirable, what we want through technology, and how we can empower users in using technology and in living a more valuable life. So that's what I will be doing. I will introduce to these three major intellectual virtues and then reflect upon the role of the social scientist in one or more of these virtues. And I will start from the beginning, because there is some kind of chronological order in that, even though they sometimes overlap. And I will begin with what I refer to as the first wave. Actually, the moment that our discipline started to grow out as a distinct discipline. And that was in the early 80s. And in order to understand why it all started there, our human-computer interaction research, we have to get an understanding of what the technological context was in these days. In the early 80s, it was the first time that some computer systems were being used in a work context with people who did not have a proper formal technical training. So by people who were not programmers, no computer scientists, no engineers. But they started to use it in a work context. So for instance, for making complex calculations, things that people could not do themselves in terms of computation, or just to work more efficiently. But it is also important to know that the way we interacted with the technology was based on command line interfaces, or sometimes even menu or form-based interactions. So this was still kind of difficult. There was a steep learning curve. Even though you did not have to be a programmer yourself, still it was kind of difficult working with these command line interfaces. And so in the field of human-computer interaction, we were wondering how we could make these interactions with technology more easy, just by relying on information upon how our memory works. When we know we can only remember, let's say, 7 plus or minus 2 items in our short-term memory, well, maybe we can take that knowledge into account when we design for new technologies, that we do not ask people to remember in their short-term memory more than 9 items, for instance. So at that time, insights from cognitive sciences steered our design requirements, or steered our information in the field of human-computer interaction. We were studying how our memory works and then using that information to make more user-friendly applications. And now I will refer to the image which you can see here on the slide, because the kind of knowledge was really focused at how is our working memory, what kind of capacity do we have in terms of working memory, long-term memory, what is the processing speed when we try to process information, how long does it take to perceive some signals, for instance, to look at information on the screen, and how long would it take to process that information and then react, for instance, by pressing a button. And when you hear me talking about this kind of model-based thinking, you may have noticed that I'm talking about people and the end users of technology in some kind of jargon that we also use to talk about computers. I was referring to memory capacity, processing speed, input, output mechanisms, and so on. So this kind of jargon of talking about computers was also being used to talk about people, the end users of technologies. And the end users were then rather conceived as being human factors, as if they kind of shared characteristics that we also have in computers. But the main premise was that we have our shortcomings and that the computer can find solutions for that. So it's kind of a passive notion of people, kind of negative in a way, that we were stressing our shortcomings and that we were looking for a solution in the technology. The kind of research that was being performed, as said, was highly influenced by cognitive science and geared towards having or getting predictive and prescriptive advices. So predictive, in a sense that if we know how long it will take to just read an instruction on the screen, process the information, for instance, when you see an image of an animal, press yes, and you have to think animal, yes or no, process that information, and then the time that is necessary, for instance, to press a button. And then you could kind of predict the time that would be needed to fulfill an action. Or also, we could have some prescriptive advice. For instance, Miller's law is relying on the amount of information that we can store in our short-term memory, and we can use it and formulate it in a kind of heuristic to inform the designers of technologies, that they in generally have to rely on recognition rather than recall. So these were some kind of guidelines that we could pass through to the designers of technology so that they could make better products. And in the end, what the ideal world was, based on a human-computer interaction knowledge, that was that we could find the match between the system as it was intended by the designer and the interpretation of the user. If the user could understand the system in the same way as the designer intended, then there was a perfect match in a perfect world. So that was what we were striving for at that moment, so that there was no misinterpretation, that people immediately knew what the instructions were, what they had to do, and that it was kind of user-friendly to learn. So cognitive science was the kind of first influences in the domain of human-computer interaction in the early 80s. What is this kind of more cognitive science meant for our work at the Center for User Experience Research, and this focus on the micro-usability, as I call it? Well, in the Center for User Experience Research, or at that time, Center for Usability Research, we did a lot of what I can, to a large extent, categorize as first-wave research. In the beginning, we did a lot of controlled lab experiments, which is kind of typical in the cognitive science tradition. And we aimed for getting more rigid guidelines, formulate user requirements, namely this kind of prescriptive advice towards designers, what they had to take into account. I remember one of my first projects when I started working at the Center for Usability Research was testing the application for an electronic programming guide of the new interactive television of Telenet. So at that time it was brand new interactive television. So I did a lot of experiments to see how do people interpret this interface. Do they understand the jargon? Is it difficult or not? How long does it take to fulfill a task? And how can we improve it? So kind of really usability oriented, and the kind of knowledge that we could generate could be revealed in some more controlled lab environments. However, soon it was kind of realized that still this may all be very relevant and very instructive information, but it is not enough to describe this complex relationship between computers and people and how we interact with technologies. And this meant the start of a second wave of human-computer interaction research in, we're now talking about the late 80s and the early 90s. And again, I have to kind of situate the technological environment in that time period. It is from the late 80s and the early 90s that the graphical user interfaces succeeded. So at that time, we no longer had to interact with computers with the command line interactions, but we could see the symbols, the icons. We could see these on the screen and just grab these and move these. So it was more intuitive to interact with computers. So that was one major technological revolution. And the second one was the internet. So it meant a major breakthrough to use technologies in a totally different way. Before that, technologies were mainly used for individual productivity, to do complex calculations, to organize your work in a more efficient way. And now computers meant the start of real collaboration, which was not dependent upon the location where you are. You could work together with your co-workers on the same document, for instance, and you should not be on the same place. Also, computers were used for communication. This was all new. It may sound now so evident, but at that time it was a major breakthrough. And it is in this period that the field and field of human-computer interaction really grew out as a very big discipline. And when you read this, computers being used for communication and collaboration, we get to our own focus. Our faculty of communication sciences is all about mediated communication. So we're getting there. And it may not surprise that it is from the late 80s and the early 90s that social sciences emphasis kind of were introduced in the domain of human-computer interaction. And this was because people realized that the knowledge that we found by doing these lab experiments may be valid within that controlled environment. But soon as from the moment that we start introducing the technology in a certain context, there are a lot of other contextual influences that determine the way we interact with technologies. So it was felt that we should complement this first wave knowledge with more holistic, in-depth descriptive accounts of the action as it evolves in a particular situation. And this may be very dependent upon, for instance, cultural practices. What is happening in one company is not necessarily the way that same technology is being used in another company, for instance. Now we have it, for instance, at the KU Leuven, we're kind of merging high schools for instance, Groep T and KU Leuven. And I know from some of my Groep T colleagues that suddenly they have to use our SAP system. It's kind of horror. It's not adapted to their practices. But people may say, hey, it's kind of educational system, so it should be kind of the same. But it isn't. We have a way of organizing our work, and that's often not written down in the official procedures. So we have to look at the everyday practices, because computation is part of a very rich fabric of relationships. And it is not limited to technology only. It's the way the interaction with technology unfolds between people, institution, and a very rich contextual background. So what is this? How this influences the work at the Center for Usability Research? Well, suddenly we get out of our labs and we went into the fields. Seeing the daylight is always good for us. And we started studying work practices in context. Remember last year we had a team building activity where we had the mobile phone city game. Well, some of my colleagues tested that game, and they really tested it in the field. So that meant that they put on their running shoes, and then they were just with mobile cameras. They were following these groups, because you may test these kind of games, group game mobile applications in the laboratory, but then you miss out the contextual aspects. Can you look at this small screen when it is a very sunny day? And how are the group dynamics interfering with the way we interact? We only have one device in a group. Is it only the group leader who holds it and the other people are not involved? On the contrary, they leave behind. How can we stimulate it? Can we all look at the screen? Is it possible or isn't it possible? How can we track the location where we are? What kind of cues do we need? All kind of information that we would not find when we would have limited our study to the laboratory only. Another project that I've recently finished, that was last year, was also very much second wave oriented. We were wondering why some hospitals adopt electronic healthcare records and why other hospitals aren't doing so. So you know that now hospitals can choose whether they have like a digital file with all your medical information, which has some advantages, or whether hospitals just keep it all just on paper and in an analog form. And we saw that some hospitals even changed. They invested a lot of money from changing from paper forms towards electronic forms, but it failed and they moved back to paper forms. So you may ask, why is that? They invested so much money. You don't want to know how much these implementation processes cost, and still they wanted to go back. So what we did is we really went into the field. We went to hospitals. We questioned and followed all kinds of people in different roles and see what was it that made the success of adopting electronic healthcare records. And what we saw was that it was not so much the technology. Okay, the technology was important. It should be user-friendly and so on. But what we saw was that the real breakthrough came by the implementation process. So it's this kind of intangible aspects that made the breakthrough of adopting towards digital forms or not. We saw that when hospitals invested a lot in training, in communication, in follow-up, in having key lead users, and so on, when this implementation process was right, well, then the electronic healthcare records could have a major success, even if from a technological and usability perspective, the technology was suboptimal. So this really advocates to have this kind of holistic view, because there is more to say than just the technology and the usability, the micro-usability only. Another thing was that in the 80s and 90s, as the internet broke through and a graphical user interface, a lot of new applications came to the market. And it is also in this time period that the practitioner of being a usability expert was also more and more prominent in the in companies. Suddenly you saw the rise of new profiles of being a usability expert, and this was being reflected or this was the result of some kind of human-computer interaction research practices where we saw the advantage of designing new applications in an iterative way, where we start by getting to understand the users for which we design, in which context, and then where we start prototyping and testing our application or our concept with users in a very early phase and in an iterative phase. So again, this is something that we did in our Center for Usability Research as well. We've become expert in doing user-centered design involving users in the design of new technologies, and this way account for user characteristics and the needs and the functionalities that are necessary to perform these tasks in a particular context. In the beginning, the main driver for doing so was to get more user-friendly products, and as we will see later on, the motivation for doing so has changed a little bit, or there are other motivations of doing so, as we will see later on. So user-centered design and relying on more ethnography-inspired practices have really changed our methodologies in Center for Usability Research, or at least has broadened our toolbox so that we did not only stay in our labs, but also went out to the field. But still, we stopped somewhere in the late 90s, and we should not stop there, because what we see is that in very broad terms, a third wave has started as well. More particularly since the late 90s, and it's still going on, we see that again, the focus has slightly changed or kind of broadened, actually, and this came with the advent of ubiquitous computing, mobile computing, wearables, sensor-based computing. What you see here on the picture is an example of wearing sensors to track yourself. And so when you go out for a run, that you can see how much calories you burned, how fast you ran, and other information about yourself. So we're getting these computers out of only the work context, and that is something very important. Again, this may sound very evident right now, but at the time period of the first and the second wave, we were still mainly focusing at computers and technologies which were being used in a work context. Now, technologies are everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It is even in our most intimate zones, and that is our cells, our body. Think of the evolution of the quantified self, where we can track ourselves or monitor our health, monitor what we are doing. So it's getting out of the work context. It is still in a work context, but it's also moving towards non-work, even non-purposeful and non-rational settings. We're kind of using technology more and more for pursuing a healthier, more meaningful lifestyle. So we're getting rid of that focus on using technology only for productivity reasons. No, it is also for entertainment, for empowerment. So it's kind of different goals that we are pursuing in the design of technologies. And as we are broadening the focus and also considering more uses for technology, it may also not surprise that again we have new influences in our domain of human-computer interaction. And one particular new influence that we see in our domain is the influence from the arts and humanities. And actually, there is also an explanation for that. And for that, I have to refer back to that ideal in first-wave research. Remember that in the early days of human-computer interaction, we were looking for that perfect match between the system as it was intended by the designer on the one hand, and the system as it is interpreted by the user. Well, nowadays, we can no longer do that. Nowadays, a lot of technologies have several uses, and the designers cannot anticipate all uses of technologies. On the contrary, what we see is that designers are more and more giving us kind of empty toolboxes that we can use to do something with it. Actually, a social network is no more than an interface, and we provide the context. The content. The content is not pushed to us, but the interface is kind of stimulating us to provide content. And sometimes it's more pushing us to share some visual material, another time it's pushing us or stimulating us to share more written, but still it is us, the end users, who are giving the meaning of these technologies based upon the tools that are provided to us. The same for WordPress, a blogger, it is also a toolbox for us, and we are determining what we are doing with that. And that is very typical nowadays. We cannot anticipate everything. Think of the 3D printing technology. You can use it in several ways, even to create a gun with it. We heard it in the news. And these are probably all future uses that the designers did not intend. They did not say, hey, let's create a technology by which people can create a gun. So it is kind of, the possible uses are endless. And this is something that we see coming back in the arts and the humanities. The arts and the humanities look at artifacts and consider the various interpretations that we can make when we reflect upon a certain artifact. And the same goes for technology. We can interpret the meaning of technology in various ways, and sometimes it's good to have to consider that technology from a distance, because maybe we are into one use of a system or into one application, but someone else can be in another. And the frameworks from arts and humanities can help us to look at it from a distance and to consider the various uses. Also, why are these insights from arts and humanities so relevant? Because, as I said, we're not only focusing on technology for work reasons, for efficiency, it's also for entertainment aspects as the aesthetics, the beauty, emotions evoked by emotions, the fact that by technologies. The fact that technologies can be there just as for raising critical awareness, for making us think about life. It is a whole section in human-computer interaction dealing with critical design, how we can make people reflect upon certain life events just by means of the technology. So all kind of trends nowadays that explain why these frameworks from arts and humanities matter more and more. So how do these trends influence the work at the Center for User Experience Research? Well, it is because we have seen also that where we focused in the beginning a lot on usability, we have broadened our focus and also focus on more the experiential aspects, the hedonics, the motivational aspects. Why do people use technologies? How can we improve a more meaningful experience? And so this really meant that this really triggered us to decide to change our name, to move and to get away from that label where we would only focus on usability, and to use for that more broader term of user experience, because there is more than just usability, and that is very important. And coincidentally, user experience started with a U, so that was very handy. So we could use that word, but we could have used other aspects as well, where we could focus more on the emotions or hedonics. But the way we conceive user experience is really like an umbrella term, where we open up for these insights from third wave research as well. But also remember that I said that we have that kind of methodology where we really believe in involving the users in our research. And the reason for that, the reason that I gave for that was kind of a pragmatical reason, namely that when we involve the users in our design, that we get better products in the end. But there is also a moral reason for doing so. And actually, we believe that it is our kind of responsibility when we are thinking about new technologies for people, that's actually we have to involve these people who will eventually be affected by the design. So it is some kind of empowering the users, not only for practical reasons to get a better understanding of their needs, characteristics, but also from some kind of moral duty. We're kind of designing for these people, so let they have a voice in our research. Let it be reflected in what we are kind of doing. And also, as these technologies determine more and more of our life, we're kind of tracking ourselves. We're having a lot of personal data. We can do a lot of things with that, both in a positive and in a negative way. So we're getting some kind of responsibility. So being able to decide upon how technology looks like and trying to understand what our interaction is, we also have a responsibility in order to make a critical awareness of what we are doing, that it really can have some effects. So having said this evolution from first, second, and third wave, you may have noticed that there is a prominent role of the social scientist in human-computer interaction, especially to complement the first wave research, where we were studying behaviors as if we were all following one plan and that everybody is behaving the same. No, we aren't. We are interacting with technologies depending upon the context, the people that we are interacting with. So it is important to have more that holistic view, which we have seen from the second wave onwards. And also, as technology is becoming more and more important in our life, and not only helping us to perform more efficiently, it is also very important for us to initiate a more reflection-based dialogue upon that. So how can we do that? In three ways. First of all, more ethnography-inspired work. And we're kind of doing that a lot in the Center for User Experience Research. We go into the field. I already gave examples. We like to use some artifacts to help us get an insight into these contextual practices. Also, we involve the end users in our design, both for practical and moral reasons. And again, we tend to use a lot of creative techniques. And the reason for that is, and this is a screenshot from one of the posters hanging up in this room, actually for two reasons, as you see here in the upper right picture. On the one hand, we believe that visual material can help us to trigger our reasoning process, because by looking at some artifacts, we can get inspiration, or it can help us to trigger creativity or reflection. That's on the one hand, so in terms of kind of brainstorming and idea generation. But on the other hand, creative techniques are also a very, very powerful way to communicate results and communicate information. They say a picture says more than 1,000 words. The same kind of goes from kind of making your ideas more tangible. And then thirdly, to account for these more arts and humanities influences and focusing on these subjective cultural qualities of interactions with technologies, the artifacts interpretative schemes and frameworks from arts and humanities may work a lot. And in order to understand this overlap or the reason why we can be inspired by the frameworks from arts and humanities, I will explain to you this model which you can see here on the slide. When we consider the upper layer, this is the way the frameworks in arts and humanities are being used in a more traditional way. Consider, for instance, that you're looking at a book. Well, the book is the artifact. In which way is it being written? How is the story being built? How is the protagonist being introduced, and so on. So the focus on the artifact is one thing, but you can also focus on the creator. Who is the writer of that book? What kind of characteristics? What's his agenda? So secondly, the creator is important, but also the consumer, eventually the people who read the book will ultimately determine the reading and the meaning that is given to that book. And that consumer or that reader will all do that against his background. So the social context is also very important. In what time period is this book being read? Against which kind of cultural baggage? So all these aspects are very relevant in order when you want to study, for instance, books. The same goes for paintings, other cultural artifacts. And what we see is that there is a nice parallel with the focus that we can have in human-computer interaction research, where the artifact becomes the interface, and where the creator is a designer, and where the consumer is eventually the end user, all in a particular social context. So these are some techniques that can help the social scientist in the domain of human-computer interaction to provide added value. And why is that so important? Because ultimately, it is not only instructive to question how technology is shaping the way we behave and how we are, but also how we are shaping technologies. And my premise is that many technologies and design choices today are no longer value-free. And I was just this morning reading the newspaper, and the scoop on the first page was Facebook is giving us more privacy. And I think this is a very, very good example to show how design is no longer value-free. We are dependent upon the way the technology is being designed to master our own privacy, to do what we want with our personal data. And we see there is a lot of debate going on whether we can enhance privacy by design. You just have to Google pet once, and either you get a lot of animals, or when you Googled it once before, you get the privacy enhancing technologies. There is a lot to do how we can through technology, help people to master their privacy in a way that they want to do so. The debate that has been going on is whether Facebook is having these default settings on purpose, or had it, because it changed apparently, whether Facebook is having it on default public, and whether Facebook is making it on purpose more difficult for us to change it. And it all depends how we are dealing with technologies and with our personal data, and where personal data for us may be something to increase our social capital, to do some kind of identity building. Actually, for other stakeholders, there are other values involved. And typically for the makers of these platforms, there is a lot of monetary incentives involved. And these values often clash. And how do you deal with that? What do you do when you have totally different values in the various stakeholders of designers? What do you do? And it is important to open the debate. So the social scientist 2.0 should be some kind of value-sensitive design critic, and should open the debate on these conflicting values. And the reason why I have defined a role as one of 2.0 is because I find it resonating well with some major characteristics of the Web 2.0. Namely, we've seen, and you had my short introduction into the history of human-computer interaction, that a lot of our focus now comes from a response to technological and social changes. And the same goes for Web 2.0. And also, our role as being social scientists 2.0 is sharing a lot of characteristics with Web 2.0 constructs, namely aspects like participation, user empowerment, collaboration, rich user experiences. So what I would like to conclude with is that the instrumental rationality remains vital, but it is time to complement human-computer interaction 1.0 research with our social science sensitivity. I thank you for your attention.